14. Igor Lannis. At around 4 a.m. one day in 2022, 911 dispatchers in Oakland County, Michigan, received a call from a woman named Rachel, who said she had been shot by her father, 53-year-old Igor Lannis. When responding deputies arrived, a man later identified as Lannis answered the door with a gun in his hand and immediately began shooting. Left with no choice but to return fire for their own safety, the deputies fatally shot Lannis. Rachel survived her injuries, but her mother, 56-year-old Tina Lannis, and the family dog died from multiple gunshot wounds. Another daughter, Rebecca, wasn't home at the time of the shooting. According to investigators, Lannis got into a heated argument with Tina and Rachel, who were about to leave the property when he grabbed his gun. While it's unclear what the disagreement was about, Rebecca Lannis has made it clear that she doesn't believe the violent incident stemmed from ordinary circumstances. Speaking with the Detroit News in the aftermath of the bizarre tragedy, Rebecca described how her father became wholly consumed by conspiracy theories following the 2020 presidential election. Lannis became convinced that the election was rigged and latched onto a plethora of other paranoid views about things like vaccines and 5G technology. He became an obsessive participant in discussions about the right-wing movement known as QAnon and believed that a deep state of secret institutions were working together to disguise the United States as a democracy. According to Rebecca, Lannis became so absorbed in his new belief system that nobody could persuade him to even consider other points of view. He became completely overcome by a sense of deep mistrust and irrational skepticism of everything and everyone around him. Rebecca blamed her father's obsession with conspiracy theories for triggering the deadly fit of rage that saw her mother murdered. She told NBC News that just a handful of years earlier, during the 2016 election, her father was normal. Lannis supported Trump, making him no different than many other Americans who felt the same way. But when rumors swirled about the 2020 election being a setup, it seemed to plant a seed of doubt that bred an extremely volatile and borderline delusional view that pretty much everything was a lie on the surface. 13. A mother's murder. 38-year-old Anastasia Milovskaya was a real estate agent and single mum from Balashika, Russia, who only wanted the best for her child. Like many parents, she paid attention to who her daughter hung out with, and she disliked the impression she got of a particular boy. The young man was staying in her flat and she wanted him to leave, so she told him he had to move out, but this was unacceptable to both him and Anastasia's daughter. To prevent the girl's friend from having to find somewhere else to live, the teens devised an evil plot. It would involve having two of their friends get rid of Anastasia so she could no longer control who her daughter spent time with or who lived in her home. In exchange for the favor, the hired help were each promised a few $1,000s, which Anastasia's daughter planned to take from her mother's savings. They put their plan into action in early 2023 when an unsuspecting Anastasia entered her own home and was beaten and strangled to death. According to investigators, the victim's daughter and her friend let the killers into the flat and were present when it happened. The killers left Anastasia's body in the flat for the next 2 days, and they returned and wrapped it in plastic and a mattress. They dumped her body in a garbage can, and it was soon discovered by a janitor. It didn't take the cops long to figure out who was most likely responsible. All 4 suspects were subsequently arrested and are being detained while the case plays out in court. The teen's grandmother echoed Anastasia's sentiments about her daughter's wayward friend, saying he was from a difficult family and was having a bad effect on the girl. A friend of Anastasia's daughter recalled hearing the girl mention multiple times that she hated her mother. But everyone who spoke about the tragedy mentioned that Anastasia did everything in her power to give her daughter a good life. If convicted, the 4 suspects will spend at least 10 years in a penal colony for young offenders. 12. Christine Bahia and Christopher Snyder. Life was difficult right from the beginning for Christine Bahia, whose father died when she was young and whose mother was an addict. In addition to the struggles she experienced at home while growing up in Long Island, New York, she was made fun of at school for having a condition called alopecia, which causes a person's hair to fall out. Things got a little better in high school after Bahia returned with her mother and moved to the Houston suburb of Clear Lake City. There, she befriended two popular girls, Tiffany Rowell and Rachel Colorutis, who gave her a makeover. By 2003, it seemed as if the young woman's life had made a complete turnaround. She was even voted the most irresistible student at her school. But that all changed later that year when Bahia met and began dating 21-year-old Christopher Lee Snyder. The relationship was volatile from the start. In addition to using drugs together, the couple often fought due to Bahia's jealousy issues. And on one occasion, she allegedly went to Snyder's home and threatened to kill his family. One day, the dysfunctional pair decided to steal drugs from Rachel Colorutis and Tiffany Rowell, the very women who'd befriended Bahia when she had nobody else. They went to Rowell's home, where she and Colorutis were joined by Rowell's boyfriend, Marcus Priscilla, and Priscilla's cousin, Adelbert Sanchez. And at some point during the gathering, an argument broke out. Snyder opened fire on the four friends, shooting each one of them multiple times. Rowell, Sanchez, and Priscilla died from their gunshot wounds. Colorutis survived her initial injuries and was attempting to crawl to her phone when Bahia bludgeoned her to death with a .38 caliber revolver. After helping her boyfriend carry out the horrific massacre, Bahia went to her job at Walgreens as if it were any other day. Nearly 3 years passed without any leads, while detectives tried to make sense of the crime, which quickly became a whodunit. But law enforcement never stopped looking for answers and appealing to the public for information. Finally, in 2008, an anonymous tipster called Crime Stoppers and said that Bahia had confessed to the crime while they were in rehab together. By then, Bahia and Snyder had broken up, and Bahia had relapsed and started doing drugs again. She was married to a fellow addict, and the couple had gone into hiding months before that crucial tip was called in, after realizing that investigators were still determined to solve the case. They spent 8 months holed up at a motel in San Antonio, Texas, while their drug habits worsened. Just a few weeks after the new information came in, police tracked Bahia down at the motel and arrested her for quadruple murder. Around the same time, Snyder was found dead in a forest based on information from another tip that had been called into law enforcement. Bahia was convicted of 4 counts of capital murder, and in the end she received a life sentence, with the possibility of parole starting in 2046, when she's 60 years old. 11. Shea Groves. Most of us will never understand why some people idolize serial killers, but it's a real phenomenon, and some of these superfans go as far as trying to commit horrific crimes that match or even outdo the actions of their role models. 27-year-old Shea Groves decorated her home in the English town of Havant with framed photos of Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Peter Sutcliffe, and other notorious serial killers who went down in history for their gruesome crimes. She also had a collection of books about these disgraced members of society, and a collection of weapons including knives, Viking axes, and a Celtic dagger that she kept beneath her pillow. Some might wonder if Groves was waiting for an opportunity to act out on a sadistic fantasy on someone. And while that may never be definitely proven, she did take drastic measures one day in 2022 when she thought her boyfriend, a 25-year-old father of 2 named Frankie Fitzgerald, was talking to another woman. Fitzgerald had actually blocked the woman and wasn't communicating with her at the time, but Groves was apparently too blinded by jealousy to realize this. Taking a page out of her hero's handbooks, she murdered Fitzgerald in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. Using her prized Celtic dagger, Groves cut her boyfriend's throat and then plunged the blade into his chest 17 times. According to investigators, she relied on true crime documentaries in her attempt to create a false narrative and stage an alibi. But her expertise was no match for the seasoned detectives who identified her as the culprit responsible for Fitzgerald's murder. Prosecutors accused Groves of launching the deadly attack while her boyfriend was asleep in her bed. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 23 years. During her sentencing hearing, the judge described the relationship between Groves and Fitzgerald as having a dangerous dynamic fueled by alcohol and cocaine. He concluded that Groves acted on impulse when she lost her temper over her cheating suspicions, resulting in a needless tragedy that took one young person's life and destroyed another's future. 10. Rory Banks. During the pre-dawn hours one morning in May 2021, 44-year-old Rory Banks left his Wheatland, California home armed with 2 handguns, multiple knives, pepper spray, and a hit list containing the names and addresses of 4 men he planned to kill that night. Banks didn't know his targets personally. He simply chose them because they have records of being perverts. Roughly a mile from his home, he broke into the residence of 55-year-old Ralph Mendez and fatally shot him. Immediately afterward, Banks aborted his plan to continue with his killing spree and instead called 911 on himself. He was waiting in the driveway of the victim's home when police arrived. A subsequent investigation turned up alarming evidence of Banks being deeply immersed in conspiracy theories. He subscribed heavily to the beliefs of the far-right political movement known as QAnon, which spews arguably baseless claims about world elites being involved in ritualized cannibalism, human trafficking, and other horrific behaviors. In a statement, the Yuba District Attorney's Office wrote that the defendant's beliefs were encouraged by fringe conspiracy theories that are often spread through social media. Rory's wife, Julie Banks, told CBS 13 that her husband became increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to the shooting. More specifically, he became preoccupied with local offenders. Most sane people would agree that individuals who commit the types of crimes that inspired Banks's hit list are often some of the most despicable members of society. But most people in their right mind also understand that murder isn't the answer to any problem, unless someone wants to end up in prison themselves. In most cases, vigilante justice has no place in a civilized society, yet Banks seemed fully convinced that he was doing an honorable deed. And many people who are typically against someone taking the law into their own hands think Banks was doing the right thing. Some have even hailed him as a hero, which only further encourages the disturbing beliefs that inspired his behavior. Yuba County District Attorney Clint Curry responded to the misguided support for Banks by reminding the public that the US is a government of laws and not of men, and that nobody should get a pass for committing a cold-blooded murder. Throughout his trial for the slaying of Mendez, Banks' attorney argued that his client should be found insane or guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter due to his belief that his attempted killing spree would protect his community. The jury, however, found Banks to be legally sane and convicted him of murder and burglary. As a result, he was sentenced to 60 years to life in prison. 9. Jessica Sacco. When things didn't work out with her ex-boyfriend in Florida, 21-year-old Jessica Ray Sacco moved back to her home state of Ohio at the urging of her mother, Sue, who offered to help the young woman get back on her feet. In addition to her recent heartbreak, Jessica struggled with depression and bipolar disorder. Sue paid for an apartment for her daughter while she focused on getting her life together. But as long as Jessica's mother was covering the rent, she imposed one main rule: no moving anyone in, especially boyfriends. Shortly after returning to Ohio, Jessica connected with a 25-year-old man from Texas named Matthew Puccio. Ignoring her mother's one stipulation, she invited him to move in with her. The pair bonded over their shared love for the insane clown posse and the juggalo culture that the group's fans are known for. Sue disapproved of the new living arrangement, especially as Jessica began acting increasingly distant and moody. The concerned mother became even more worried when she learned that Matthew had persuaded Jessica to stop taking her medication. However, Jessica was an adult, and there was little Sue could do to stop her from doing what she wanted. Shortly after his arrival, Matthew invited his unemployed friends, Andrew Forney and his wife Candace, to move into Jessica's apartment. The couple didn't pay rent, they were slobs, the space was far too small for 4 adults, and Jessica didn't want them there. And it was pretty clear that the Forneys didn't like Jessica either, yet they felt entitled to live in her home. Jessica initially tolerated the Forneys' presence at the urging of her boyfriend, who reminded her that juggalos and juggalettes never turn their backs on each other. But when Matthew invited another couple, Sharon Cook and Chris Wright, to move into the already overcrowded apartment, Jessica began to feel fed up. She asked her mum if she could move home, but Sue was at the end of her rope with the drama and said no. Shortly after that, Jessica stopped answering text messages and went silent on social media. 8 days later, her dismembered partial remains were found along roadsides throughout Ohio and Kentucky. By the time the rest of her body was found in her apartment, her unwelcome guests were long gone. Puccio had stabbed Jessica and missed her vital organs. She then lived for several hours before he suffocated her with a plastic bag. His friends helped dismember and dispose of the body. It was an all-day affair, which included a McDonald's break and a trip to a local convenience store. Everyone involved had ample time to report the situation and possibly even to save Jessica's life. But nobody intervened, and they were charged accordingly. Puccio was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years to life. The other 4 defendants received sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years for their roles in the horrific tragedy. 8. Catherine and Andrew Sue. Siblings Catherine and Andrew Sue were teenagers when their father died in 1986, and their mother was killed in a robbery gone wrong in Chicago the following year. So, at just 18 years old, Catherine became Andrew's legal guardian. Amid his own father's absence, Andrew became close with Catherine's live-in boyfriend, a local bar owner named Robert O'Dubain. But Catherine had the most influence over her brother, and even after he left Chicago and moved to Providence, Rhode Island for college, when Catherine decided she wanted O'Dubain out of the picture, she persuaded Andrew to do her bidding by claiming that the man he'd come to regard as a second father was abusing her and stealing her money. In 1993, Andrew flew to Chicago at his sister's urging and fatally shot 31-year-old O'Dubain. After spending his entire life staying out of trouble and being a top scholar, he'd committed a crime that even most seasoned criminals would never even consider, and afterward he immediately went on the run. Catherine soon learned that Andrew's willingness to do her dirty work didn't mean that she was off the hook. Her story quickly began to unravel during questioning, and she was charged within days of O'Dubain's murder. Being at his sister's beck and call the way he was, Andrew immediately booked a ticket to Chicago after learning of Catherine's arrest. He was then captured at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport with $65,000 in cash and some of O'Dubain's IDs in his possession. Andrew confessed to the murder and revealed that he wasn't motivated by O'Dubain's life insurance policy, as detectives had theorized. He said he committed the gruesome crime out of family loyalty, a value that had been drilled into his head as a child growing up in a traditional South Korean family, and which Catherine had allegedly used as a way to influence him into doing what she wanted. Andrew was convicted of murder and received an 80-year sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in 2032, or maybe even sooner, due to a new Illinois law granting early parole to certain young offenders. Catherine was also convicted of murder and received a life sentence with no possibility of parole. 7. Jennifer Faith and Darren Lopez. From the outside looking in, Jamie and Jennifer Faith had a perfect marriage. They seemed genuinely in love and financially secure thanks to Jamie's job as an IT director for American Airlines, which afforded them a comfortable life in suburban Dallas. However, the couple's seemingly peaceful lives were shattered one day in 2022 while they walked their dog together near their home. Out of nowhere, a gunman approached Jamie from behind and then shot him 7 times, and unfortunately, he died from his injuries. The community rallied around Jennifer, who managed to avoid the gunfire. She went on TV multiple times pleading with the public for information that might help identify her husband's killer. Meanwhile, she set up a crowdfunding campaign asking for help paying her bills. Donations flooded in, totaling more than $60,000. But the public would soon learn the awful truth. Jennifer had gotten bored with Jamie. Months before the murder, she reconnected with Darren Ruben Lopez, an old flame living in Tennessee, and the two embarked on an intense emotional affair. Jennifer convinced Lopez, a disabled Army veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder and a traumatic brain injury, that Jamie was abusing her in horrific ways. preying on her secret lover's protective instincts, his desire to be a hero, and perhaps the clouded judgment resulting from his brain injury, Jennifer insisted that the only way to make Jamie's abuse stop was by killing him. She also posed as a friend and sent him emails backing up her claims and emphasizing the urgent need for Jamie to die. Most people would never murder someone, even if it meant sparing a loved one from abuse, but Lopez took the bait and killed Jamie. Afterward, Jennifer showered him with a big screen TV and other gifts she bought using money from the fundraiser. She also tried cashing in on a $629,000 life insurance policy she took out on Jamie before his death. However, the company refused to issue the funds as long as the case remained unsolved. Luckily, Jennifer never saw the money. In 2021, she and Lopez were arrested for killing Jamie. Jennifer was spared from the death penalty in exchange for pleading guilty to one federal count of murder for hire, and instead she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The cases against Lopez are ongoing, but he's pleaded not guilty to both state and federal charges. 6. Chance Seneca. 18-year-old Holden White thought he was meeting a potential romantic interest when he got together with Chance Seneca after connecting on the Grindr dating app in 2020, but Seneca had different plans. He picked White up and drove him to an isolated property in rural Lafayette Parish, Louisiana, where he forced his date to put on handcuffs. Seneca then stabbed, strangled, and beat White until he thought the victim was dead. After trying and failing to dismember White's body, Seneca called the police, confessing to killing someone, and asked to be taken to a mental institution. Miraculously, White managed to pull through after spending several days in a coma and a month in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Investigators discovered that Seneca had met up with another man the night before with the intention of killing him, but had chosen not to follow through with the plan. In fact, he'd spent months crafting a carefully devised plan to murder and kidnap gay men in an attempt to mimic the crimes of the notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. He also planned to preserve and eat his victims' bodies, as Dahmer had done. Seneca admitted that White was meant to be the first of many victims, and that he had no plans to stop murdering gay men until he was caught or killed. White continues to suffer from long-term physical and mental effects of the attack, including the loss of feeling in one of his hands. Federal authorities prosecuted the case as a hate crime. And in September 2022, Seneca took a plea deal and admitted to one count of kidnapping in exchange for a 45-year prison sentence. 5. Clara Jane Schwartz. Starting in 2001, 18-year-old Clara Jane Schwartz told pretty much anyone who'd listen that her father, a renowned DNA scientist named Robert Schwartz, had abused her and was trying to kill her. She claimed that Robert poisoned her food, pulled her underwater in their swimming pool, and hid her. Clara found a captive audience with Catherine Inglis, Inglis's boyfriend Michael Fall, and Kyle Holbert, a young man that was obsessed with witchcraft and vampires. In addition to telling them how much she hated her father and wanted him dead, Clara said that she stood to inherit a large sum of money when he passed away. But she said it might not happen unless Robert died soon, because he planned to cut her out of his will. While out to dinner one evening in September 2001, Clara claimed that her steak was poisoned and that her father must have been in touch with the cook prior to their arrival at the restaurant. As Christmas approached a few months later, she told her friends that Robert planned to make sure she didn't return from a family trip to the Virgin Islands. A lot of the group's interactions occurred over instant messages and through a role-playing game called Underworld, which prosecutors later accused Clara of using as a tool for manipulating her friends into killing her father. After months of hearing about how awful Robert Schwartz supposedly was, Kyle Holbert offered to kill him. A few weeks later, Inglis and Foll dropped him off outside Robert's home in Leesburg, Virginia. When Robert answered the door, Holbert launched into a frenzied attack, stabbing the complete stranger over 30 times with a 2-foot sword. Police quickly narrowed down their suspect pool to Clara Schwartz, Kyle Holbert, Catherine Inglis, and Michael Foll. During Clara's trial, her defense attorney argued that Holbert had taken her imaginative behavior during their role-playing game more seriously than it was actually meant. The prosecution painted Clara as a cruel and cunning mastermind who hand-selected a group of impressionable peers to do her dirty work for her. Both sides depicted Holman as fantasy-prone, with a long history of mental illness and a desire to be seen as a hero. In the end, Clara was found guilty of murder and received a sentence of 48 years in prison. Holbert was also convicted of murder and received a life sentence, while Fall was sentenced to 18 years and Inglis only served 1. 4. Martin Bryant. Australian mass shooter Martin Bryant is a born killer. Like many murderers, he got his start at an early age by torturing and killing animals. As a child, he was difficult to get along with, prone to tantrums, had no friends, and was fascinated by violence. He also never outgrew these traits going into adulthood. Later on in Bryant's life, experts would try to find an explanation for his destructive behavior. Some blamed the fact that he was bullied relentlessly as a schoolboy and well into his adulthood, while others believed his mental health and a learning disability were the primary causes. People also pointed the figure at external influences like movies and TV. When Child's Play 2 came out in 1990, Bryant developed an unhealthy obsession with the film. He talked about the movie constantly, according to his ex-girlfriend Janetta Hoani, and he seemed genuinely fascinated by watching a murderous doll named Chucky rack up dozens of kills. Only Bryant himself could truly be blamed for the bad things he went on to do, but it's hard not to wonder if he was inspired by things on TV that most people wouldn't want to see happen in the real world. Many believe Bryant first started killing people in 1992, when a wealthy older woman he lived with, Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey, died in a car accident with Bryant in the passenger seat. He was never formally charged with causing Harvey's death, nor was he accused of killing his father, who was found dead in a dam with a weight around his neck the following year. But there are a few people out there that are wholly convinced that Bryant didn't kill Harvey or his dad. One morning in 1996, at the age of 29, Bryant went on a shooting spree in the historic village of Port Arthur. Armed with a semi-automatic AR-15 rifle, he killed 34 people and injured 23 more in a 22-minute period. He then barricaded himself in a guest house with a hostage and a stockpile of guns. An 18-hour standoff ensued as Bryant shot at the police, making it impossible to get anywhere close to him. The ordeal finally ended when he killed his hostage and set the guest house on fire. Bryant emerged from the building in flames, which had to be extinguished before he was taken into custody. As a result, he received 35 life sentences and will remain behind bars until his dying day. The Port Arthur shooting sparked major changes in Australia's gun laws, which are still currently in place and are largely credited with dramatically reducing gun violence in the country. 3. Erin Caffey and Charlie Wilkinson. From the moment they met in 2007, Charlie Wilkinson and Erin Caffey were head over heels for each other. Their relationship got serious fast, and within months, Charlie had bought Erin a promise ring and even mentioned marriage. Erin's parents were less than crazy about their daughter's boyfriend though. Something about Charlie just didn't sit right with them, and a quick check of his social media seemed to confirm their suspicions about him being a partier. In early 2008, after getting tired of waiting for the thrill of the relationship to wear off for the couple, they made Erin break up with Charlie. However, the pair refused to accept that this was the end of their relationship, and they vowed not to let Erin's parents stop them from seeing each other. Instead of sneaking around or simply breaking the rules and dealing with the consequences later, like most rebellious teens, they decided that Erin's parents needed to die. A few weeks later, Charlie, his friend Charles Wade, and Wade's girlfriend Bobby Gale Johnson drove to the family's home in Alba, Texas late at night. Before going inside, Charlie warned Erin that he and Charles would have to kill her brothers so they couldn't act as witnesses. Surprisingly, Erin green-lighted the plan and waited in the car with Bobby Gale while the two men took turns shooting the Caffeys and attacking them with a sword. Once they were sure the victims were dead, Charlie and Charles raided the house of valuables, doused the interior in lighter fluid, and set it on fire. They were completely unaware, though, that Terry Caffey, Erin's father had survived the brutal attack and had found enough strength to crawl to a neighbor's house for help. Terry was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery and eventually recovered from his injuries. Police quickly apprehended all 4 suspects, whose stories fell apart pretty much the moment they started talking. In keeping with his religious principles, Terry Caffey urged the court not to impose the death penalty against Charles and Charlie, who were serving life sentences for the triple murder. Erin was also convicted of murder and received 2 life sentences for her involvement in the crime, but she'll become eligible for parole after serving 40 years. Bobby Gale Johnson pleaded guilty to being an accomplice and was sentenced to 40 years, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Opinions remain divided to this day over who masterminded the plot. Erin herself has claimed that she ran with the wrong crowd, and her father refuses to believe that the triple slaying could have been his daughter's idea. Charlie argued that he tried talking Erin into running away with him instead of killing her family, but that she insisted on the latter. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Erin and Charlie both ruined their own lives and are paying similar prices for their horrific actions. 2. Kyle Winterbottom. The promising future of a talented athlete named Kyle Winterbottom were abruptly cut short in 2012 when he plunged 40 feet to his death off a 3rd-floor balcony in Greater Manchester, England. According to authorities, the young rugby player was trying to perform a stunt for his friends during a party at around 2 a.m. when he lost his footing and fell. He was rushed to the hospital, but nothing could be done and he died from his injuries. After ruling out the likelihood that Kyle jumped intentionally off the balcony, authorities classified his death as an accident, but they carried out a thorough investigation to be sure. They detected traces of ecstasy and a powerful animal tranquilizer called ketamine in Kyle's system, and witness reports describe Kyle as being wide-eyed and slack-jawed shortly before his fatal plunge. Kyle's parents said that their son didn't use drugs to their knowledge. After Kyle's death, rumors circulated claiming that he was drugged, but investigations ruled out the likelihood that something had been slipped into his drink without his knowledge. Based on the accounts of multiple witnesses, drugs were flowing freely at the party that night, and everyone who was using them seemed aware of their decision to do so. After visiting more than 60 households as part of a year-long probe into the incident, authorities determined that there was no third-party involvement in Kyle's death. Unwilling to accept the thought of Kyle doing drugs entirely of his own accord, his parents blamed peer pressure. They accused their son's friends of maintaining a wall of silence about what really happened that night and urged them to come forward with the truth. And while it's easy to assume that Kyle's mother and father simply refused to accept that their son wasn't as innocent as they once thought, authorities also described his friends as uncooperative. The inquest came to a frustrating dead end, with investigators concluding that multiple people could have provided useful insight into Kyle's death, but chose not to. 1. Cinnamon Brown. David Brown entered his Orange County, California home during the early morning hours one day in 1985 and found his 5th wife, 23-year-old Linda Brown, dead with 2 gunshot wounds to the abdomen. He told police that he'd left the house to get away from the seemingly endless bickering between Linda and his teenage daughter from a previous marriage, Cinnamon. David acted distraught over Linda's death, while Cinnamon took full credit for the crime. Little did anyone realize she was just doing as her father had instructed. Authorities would later learn that David told Cinnamon to shoot her stepmother and that she wouldn't get in much trouble because of her age. By then, he'd been purposefully turning the two against each other for several years. He was also having an affair with Linda's sister, Patty, and they were quick to cash in multiple life insurance policies in his dead wife's name, totaling close to $850,000. Cinnamon would later describe how her father prepared her for Linda's murder months in advance. And when the time finally came, David handed his daughter a gun and went to a nearby convenience store to solidify his alibi. Emergency responders found Cinnamon in her backyard, getting sick and clutching a handwritten apology for the crime that she'd written at David's instruction. At first, she stood by her father's orders to take the blame for Linda's death and make it seem like she acted alone. Investigators suspected that there was more to the story, but Cinnamon maintained her version of events all throughout her trial, only to realize that the court had no plans to go easy on her. And in the end, she was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Cinnamon stayed silent for a little while longer before becoming fed up with David's broken promises. She finally decided to talk after realizing her own father had used her with absolutely no concern whatsoever for her well-being. In 1988, she began wearing a wire when David visited her in prison, and the district attorney soon had enough evidence to charge him and Patty with Linda's murder. Unaware that it had been recorded, David denied the allegations against him when he was arrested. He eventually admitted to bits and pieces of the truth though, while still placing the bulk of the blame for the murder on Cinnamon and Patty. Evidence continued to implicate David when Patty agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. Desperate to avoid prison, he asked around at the local jail where he was being held to see if anyone knew a hitman who would kill Patty and 2 members of the district attorney's office. Jailhouse informants came forward, and David only dug himself a deeper hole. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole for Linda's murder and died behind bars in 2014. Cinnamon was paroled after serving 7 years, and Patty received a lenient sentence in exchange for her cooperation with the investigation. What's the most embarrassing or regrettable thing you've done at someone else's urging? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.